Unfortunately, I was, fortunately and unfortunately, I was young when Pinochet took over, and so I was 4 years old by the time of the coup, and so I grew up with this sense of horror, of injustice, of I wouldn't say fear, because my family was really always opposed to the dictatorship. My mother and father did not. We didn't have. We have friends who suffered, people who went to exile, people who were political prisoners who experienced torture. My mother was a French teacher at a high school in my hometown in Punta Arenas in Patagonia, and so she experienced firsthand how her students were taken at 16 to be interrogated and tortured because they were socialists. And so I grew up with this sense of human rights violations as a second nature. It wasn't really something that I studied in law school. By the time that I went to law school, there was not even mentioning. We were still transitioning. I went to law school. I started law school by the time that we were in the last years of Pinochet. So that's why I say I'm unfortunately and fortunately at the same time, because I think that if I would have been, instead of 4, would have been 10 by the time of the coup, my life story would have been a lot more violent probably, and a lot more difficult than the one that I had. So I came to human rights through Pinochet, and I came through women's rights through the lives of women throughout my life and through my family. I think that it was very simple for me to see that there was a contrast in the way that women were educated and the way that I was being educated in a household. There were no differences between my brother and myself.
It was usual that women became lawyers in Chile during that time?
I didn't think that it was unusual. So, but by my time, it was different than my mother's. You know, I'm from the late '80s, going to university. No, and by then there was lots of women who were lawyers already, but no partners in law firms, for example. When I went to law school, there was no bathroom for women law professors. I only had a couple of female law professors, and we only had one bathroom for women, which was in the first floor. And there was a recurrent joke in the law school that the reason why there was only one bathroom for women in the first floor was because the first floor of the University of Chile Law School had the classes for the first year law students, and women would not go farther than first year, so they didn't need bathrooms later on because the higher years were in upper floors, in the second or third floor. Now, it was a joke that was those kind of things that, you know, you see it's half joke, half serious in a way, but also I always say that I do women's rights because of the women in my family, and the type of family that I come from is a family of women who were absolute fighters, and women who saw it all. So
who saw the situation of women. So it was political or wasn't political? I mean, everything is political. But
everything is political, and I think that I come from a family of women who had to become the breadwinners, not because they chose it, but because the husband left, because husband was a gambler, because the husband was a domestic abuser. Because, you know, those type of histories that made my life think that women really had a hard time, and at the same time a mom that was very strong and never allowed me to think that I could not do whatever I wanted to do, despite the fact of her being and as I said, she's a French teacher, an incredible force, but she's seeing, growing up without her own mother because she died out of obstetric violence when she was young, in the birth of her sister. One of my grandmothers died of domestic violence, and seeing women around who had multiple clandestine abortions because there was no other type of family planning and nobody cared.
Abortion was not allowed during that time in Chile?
Chile has a very particular, interesting history with abortion, and until the late 60s there was only obstetric abortion in the case of when the life of the pregnant woman was in danger, and even then it was really, really difficult to get one. Also, I think with abortion you also have to the history of abortion in general, the women's rights in general, has a before and an after. The development of medicine allowed for abortion to be safe, right? And so clandestine or not clandestine abortion was not that safe until the 50s, if you think about it. So, but once it was really safe to have to interrupt pregnancies, it was really the legal systems that were preventing women from having control over the number of children that they could have. What it's interesting about Chile, that it's also tied to the dictatorship, is that Chile had, as I said, therapeutic abortion in the books until almost the end of the dictatorship. And Pinochet, before he left office, and because it was a request from the Catholic Church, which requested that before he left power he should prohibit also therapeutic abortion, Chile became one of those few countries that prohibited abortion even when the life of the pregnant woman was in danger. So, along with countries like Dominican Republic, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Guatemala, it became one of those countries where women could not have access to abortion, not even when their life was in danger. And that only changed a few years ago. After democracy was regained in Chile, there were several attempts, but even the democratic forces considered that it was not the time. And different bills that were presented to regain at least therapeutic abortion were stalled in Congress by the democratic forces as well. So that tells you a little bit about the importance that different people in different political parties, not only in the conservative side, give to women's rights.
And is this discussed today, or?
Yes, so finally, a few years ago, we had the first abortion law that was passed by Congress, and what happened is that it was reviewed by the Constitutional Court of Chile through a request by conservative political parties that considered that the law was not constitutional. The Constitutional Tribunal considered that the law was constitutional, but it did change critical parts of the law, expanding the use of conscientious objection for medical personnel to provide the interruption of the pregnancy. So what you have today is that you have a register of medical personnel who can object, and if they object, they are not required to fulfill with the law, and they do not have to provide legal abortions. The problem with this is that it is so poorly regulated that there are areas in Chile where everybody objects, or there is only one medical service provider who is not objecting, and so the access to legal abortion has been hindered by this really expansive interpretation of conscientious objection or of freedom of religion in the medical settings. So there is a lot that needs to be done to make abortion a lot more accessible. It is a limited abortion. It's only for 3 causes: in the case of when the life of the pregnant woman is in danger, in the case of fetal abnormality that it's incompatible with life, and and in the case of rape. But in the case of rape, it's a possibility for 12 weeks only, extended to 14 weeks for girls under, I think it's under 18. It can be up to 14 weeks. But the problem is that it still has obstacles that would, of course, hinder the possibility of a lot of girls to go and denounce, or women to say that they are pregnant because of rape and they are eligible for legal abortion. Because you need to tell the story that you were raped, and that has to be corroborated, or not corroborated, but there is a team within the hospital that has to listen to the story and see whether that story adds up and decide whether the person has access to legal abortion or not. So the law, it's complicated. The law is complicated. As it is, it's better than it's a little bit, the door was open, but it's not, definitely it's far from ideal. And access to legal abortion in Chile is very, very scattered. The numbers just are not really up to the reasonable number of women that probably would need legal abortions.
One more question before we come to the LGBTQ rights. What about feminism? The feminist movement in Chile, I think, was very important. As opposition against Pinochet. A friend of mine was running for the first woman running for president in Chile, Isabel Cácamo, and she was part of the feminist movement. So what about your connection to this movement? So the feminist movement in Chile is really, as you mentioned, is very, very important, and not only as a force opposing the dictatorship, but historically the feminist movement has been very important in Chile and in Latin America, and it's a movement that was very tied to the labor rights movement in general. So labor rights that are really important to women, as maternity leave, for example, paid maternity leave, or the right to having protections for pregnant women, have been in the books in Chile and in Latin America for many years. In the 1920s on, there have been protections for women workers, and that has been all the gains of the feminist movement in Latin America. In Chile, during the dictatorship, women played an incredible role, and it's a role that at the same time has been made invisible by even the forces that have narrated and have told the story of the opposition to Pinochet. Unless you read a book about feminism or women's rights movements within the dictatorship, you have this idea that it was really sort of like all kind of like an egalitarian, and that the few women who were part of leaders of political parties were involved, but it was not really a movement of women. And I think that that also tells you how the very concept of politics is a concept that has been built from a male gaze, from a patriarchal construction. So what we consider political and political affairs is the spaces where you see mostly men, and spaces where women historically have been relegated to the shadows. One, because the things that many women have considered important were not considered important in the public sphere, and women were relegated to the private sphere, and politics has been sort of like the space for public life, and women have been relegated to the private life. When you see the history of the struggles against the dictatorship in Pinochet, you see of Pinochet, you see spaces were really led by women, and those spaces were not considered political; were considered, social movements. The ollas comunes, the spaces in neighborhoods where people would come together when there was just real problems of poverty and hunger. That people would come together in the neighborhood to create their common food. Those were movements led by women, And those were political spaces, were spaces where the struggles against the dictatorships were discussed and were mobilized, but they are not necessarily considered as mainstream politics, you know. In Argentina, the Madres de la Plaza de Mayo. In Chile, the women who were looking for their relatives who had been tortured and disappeared, right? Those were mostly female-led, and yet they were not considered the mainstream politicians that were taking the country out of the dictatorship. But they were the ones who were, day by day, looking for their relatives in the prisons, in police, in courts, really risking their own lives to take care of their relatives. So the way that we understand politics is not in line with the spaces that societies have allowed women to thrive and where they have really built their mobilization, you know. So that's why I think that authoritarianism is one of the main spaces of authoritarianism is repressing women and keeping women in the private sphere, the invisibility.
This is how we come to where we stand today with the constitutional process in Chile. And what do you think about the role of women in the discussion of the new constitution?
Well, I think that there are two things that are really powerful here, which is also what you see with the discussions on abortion. That the discussions on abortion in the 60s were all about women as mothers and the problem of societies and making sure that we had healthy babies, which is very, very important, no question about it. But then when the new discussions on abortion, the discussions that you have today on reproductive rights, are about the lives of women, and how women have to be protected. I think that we can do a parallel also with the constitutional processes of Chile today, which is one of the first constitutional processes that have women at the center, you know, where for the first time we're not thinking about equality in theoretical terms, but women are really have been actively engaged in the political process. And so the first constitutional momentum that was a failed constitutional momentum, unfortunately, in Chile last year, was the first Chile was drafting the first constitution that we know of in modern history under gender parity. And that, which I thought that was going to have all the democracies around the world looking at this experiment, was almost invisible. Nobody knew that it was a constitution that was being drafted under gender parity. Today, in the new constitutional moment that Chile is undergoing today, one of the main fights is precisely on women's participation and gender parity, and understanding that if we don't intentionally create a design where women are at the center, women will be inevitably relegated to the private sphere. And so the story is being written. We don't know what's going to happen. But there is a risk that, again, an important fraction of the designers of this new constitutional process may not understand this.
And the LGBTQ rights, what do you think? You told me about the trial you participated. Can you explain this a little bit more?
Yeah, I mean, I think that if any movement has progressed rapidly in Latin America, has been the LGBT rights movement, which has been, unlike women's rights movement that have a mobilization and women's rights groups have been really strong since the beginning of from the late 19th century even. With the LGBT rights, with the development of LGBT rights, the first thing that you needed was a social movement, the mobilization, the development of a strong civil society. And that has happened, that I think was something that happened after Chile recovered democracy. And in Latin America in general, it's a movement that that has really risen after the 1980s, I would say. There are a lot of discrimination, but at the same time, Latin America is very different to other regions where you had very strong, for example, anti-sodomy statutes. Latin America was not in that realm, but there was a total invisibility of sexual orientation and gender identity. Those were not even concepts in any part of the world. Those were developments, right, of this of the late 20th century and the beginning of the 21st century. The way that we talked, or the societies talked about gay rights, was not about gay rights. It was about homosexuality, either as a sin or as a deviation or as a crime. And so those were the spaces that we talked about as an illness, a sin, or a crime. Those were the spaces where we talked about sexual orientation more so than anything else. And so one of the greatest developments, I think, of the end of the 20th century is precisely the understanding that we need to talk about diverse sexualities from the space of equality, and not from the space of tolerance, or the space of acceptance, or the space of medical treatment, or the space of prosecution and conversion to heteronormativity. So I think that that's a great development, and in Latin America has followed the progress that Europe also had in this area. And but it wasn't until the Inter-American System of Human Rights, which has been very, very important in promoting and protecting human rights in the region, not only against dictatorships, but also perfecting democracies and ensuring that the human rights standards are being protected, did not have any case on sexual orientation before the 2004. And in that year, that was the first case that came to the Inter-American System of Human Rights, and it was a case against Chile, precisely, of a woman who had lost custody of her 3 children for living with her lesbian partner. And it was a tough case in the sense that, of course, cases that involve children and the family are not simple, and it was that was the first case that the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights had to face. I think that it was, but it's really fascinating about that case. First of all, I think that we need to recognize the bravery of Judge Karen Atala, who, against all odds, after she suffered this discrimination by the Supreme Court of Chile, because it was the Supreme Court of Chile who took the kids away from her after she had won the custody case in lower courts in Chile. And I want to stress that because I think that also speaks about the difference between regular people and the elites. And in our case, the lower courts did not see any problem on a woman having custody of her children for living with in a very lovely environment with her partner, and it was the Supreme Court who did that. So I want to stress that point, that it was the Supreme Court that discriminated against Judge Atala, and the bravery of Judge Atala, who also was a judge, so it made it a lot more difficult in Chile for her to take this case. Opened up the door for so many other developments on LGBT rights in Latin America that, at least from my position as having been working in this case for many years, I really didn't foresee at that moment. I didn't anticipate that it was going to have this domino effect of opening up the door for same-sex marriage, for better protection of parents, not discriminate parents based on their sexual orientation.
What was your work in this case?
Pardon?
What was your work in this case?
So there were 3 organizations that were representing Yachatala and the children, and I was one of the lawyers for one of these organizations, Libertades Públicas, representing Yachatala in this case. So there was 3 lead counsels, and later on, when the case moved from the Inter-American Commission to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights, as it is the process of how the system works in Latin America, we were joined by 3 more lawyers, so 6 of us were leading this case before the system.
But you were not living in Chile during that time, or not?
No, I was in the United States and in Washington, D.C., but the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights is based in Washington, D.C., so it was, it doesn't matter really. You can take cases, regardless of where you live, you can take a case before the Inter-American system. The Inter-American Commission is it's based in D.C., and the Inter-American Court of Human Rights is in Costa Rica, in San Jose.
And today you are working for human rights after your decision to leave
academia. Yes.
Academia.
So I always had one foot in civil society, one foot in academia, because I was a faculty member at American University, Washington College of Law, which for many years has been sort of like a stronghold of human rights around the world, the space, and international law in general. So I was privileged to have incredible colleagues as, the dean of the law school at that time was Claudio Grossman, but I had wonderful colleagues such as Juan Mendez, Robert Goldman, and Claudia Martin and Diego Rodriguez Pinzon, who run the Academy of Human Rights. So I was very privileged. David Hunter in environmental human rights, Diane Orentlicker, really wonderful people, Herman Schwartz, people that I admire a lot for their own work on different spaces in human rights, and they have done a lot for not only the development of standards, but really assisting people and helping really break down barriers for so many people. So I run also the Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Law there, and we had a project on impact litigation as well. And then less than 2 years ago, in 2020, was that 2 years ago? No, 2021. We're in 2020. So in 2021, I moved to Human Rights Watch, and I have the privilege of leading a wonderful team of colleagues on women's rights.
Mm-hmm. And what is your work there?
Well, unfortunately, the issues on women's rights is there is no place around the world where we can say that women have gained equality. We have a lot of progress, of course. There are countries that are speaking now of feminist foreign policy, and we have countries that have really strong protections on gender and sexual-based violence. So we cannot say that there is no progress, but there is also regressions that are really problematic. The rise of the Taliban in Afghanistan should be a concern of all the world, and not only of women's rights organizations or women's rights activists. The Taliban have really created a system of segregation where they have banned women from most types of work. They have prohibited now girls from attending secondary education. There is also no possibility of women attending university. So you're now facing generations and generations of women who will be not only uneducated but secluded in the privacy of their homes, which of course also increases issues of violence. It increases issues of health. Access to health, to hospitals is problematic. So I think that Afghanistan is it's a place that should paint us all, and that I cannot stress how important it is for everyone to go to their own governments and say, what about it? What is it that you're doing in Afghanistan? You cannot. We cannot abandon Afghan women, and we need to hear.
They are already abandoned.
And we cannot keep doing that. Afghan women need to be listened, and they need to be at the forefront of what is necessary for Afghanistan to get out of the horrible, horrible authoritarianism that they are suffering.
Is human rights as an organization still present in?
No, not in Afghanistan. We work, no organization, yes. So we are working with women's rights activists in Afghanistan, and that's an important part of our work. But we have a huge portfolio. We work on sexual and gender-based violence. We work on economic empowerment and understanding that...
You can work with them now?
No, we work with women's rights activists in the distance. We don't decide our strategies based on what we think that women need in a particular place. The protagonists of the problems that Afghanistan is suffering are Afghan women, and we have an obligation to listen and work with Afghan women in Afghanistan. Yes.
It's possible.
Yes. Well, technology allows those type of things. Yeah. So we work on Afghanistan, we work on Iran, of course. We work on crisis, but we work also in long-term strategies to debunk structural barriers against women's autonomy. I think that one of the main issues that we need to understand is that as long as we don't strengthen women's autonomy, equality will not be achieved. Women's equality requires the understanding of autonomy as a precondition for equality. And that's what we do. So we work on different issues in different areas. We have work in Latin America, particularly on sexual and reproductive rights. We work in Europe on anti-rights narratives, and we're monitoring very closely what's going on in Poland with the regression on reproductive rights there. We work in Africa, specifically in land rights, and we work in Asia, particularly also and in Middle East and in the MENA region, with the guardianship laws that do not allow women to really even move without the authorization of their male guardian. So we have a lot of space to cover around the world. We are a big organization. Human Rights Watch is a big organization, but the Women's Rights Division is a small one. So we need to be strategic, and we need to listen to what local organizations are doing and be of service to local strategies.
Thank you, Macarena. Thank you for the interview.
No, thank you.